Sunny, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how have you ended up doing what you're doing?
So I came to HE in a kind of roundabout way. So when I was 18, I was working in the City of London for Bloomberg in the financial services sector, and I did an internship there, and I did some traveling, the gap year stuff. And then I was working for PwC in a very different world, as a tax associate, about expatriate tax. So working in the City of London, while a lot of my friends went off to university, and I didn't think it was for me. And then I didn't really have the grades either to go to what would you call top university. And so I wrote a speculative letter to the admissions tutor at Cardiff to study Spanish, because I wasn't going to study business studies or anything like that, because I'd already worked in the city. So I wasn't going into university for the job prospects. And I think that links to today's content, actually, that I'm trying to make sense of my own narrative. So I didn't go to university ever looking for a degree to get a job. I went there because I had a job and I didn't want to work. I didn't like my line of work, and I was like a bit disillusioned, in a good sense, coming out of an illusion of this is what I want. I want wealth, I want money, I want a business card, which I had, and a PA when I was 19, which is power beyond anyone should be given when they're that age. So I was quite hubristic and quite egotistical, which I still am probably. And so, but then I went to study Spanish, and I was well out of my depth. I went to Cardiff, which is a Russell Group institution, etc., which I didn't know too much about. I just knew it was a good location and a good uni, and I was studying for the love of studying. So it was very atelic. It was non-instrumental. I wasn't particularly a very good student. I got thirds in my first year, 40s, barely knew the academic literacy side of things. Then I had to write essays. And through diligence and hard work, I kind of graduated with a 2-1, and then went on to do a master's in philosophy and then a PhD in philosophy, both at Cardiff. So that wasn't by any means the trajectory of the journey that I'd envisioned for myself. I went there because I was just so fed up of working in the City of London, thinking, and knowing that PwC is one of the largest graduate employers, which would be, cock a hoop. Most universities would be cock a hoop if their graduates go on to work for PwC or Deloitte or KPMG, the big four as they're known. I can't remember the fourth one, but so that was so that kind of links to today's content. So I've already come to university in that vein. You see, I didn't come to it to get a job or to improve my prospects necessarily.
Okay. So obviously, as we've agreed to talk about game theory today, more specifically relating to education. And so obviously, in terms of game theory, my knowledge is kind of limited. I have been quite interested in the concept of, the application of the theory in different sectors or different aspects of life, I guess. And so obviously, I suppose at the kind of most basic level, we're talking about things like finite games and infinite games, and what it would look like in different sectors, or, like I said, different aspects of life. And so I guess the first thing before we kind of delve into it properly is that for you personally, where did you get this idea of applying game theory to education? In terms of where did it come from? Like, why did you kind of get into it in the first place?
So I taught. My background's in my PhD is philosophy, so I was teaching philosophy at Cardiff, and one of the sessions had to be on game theory. I didn't choose it; it was compulsory for first years, and it was a very it's obviously rooted in the Cold War, kind of to the nuclear and acting like a nuclear deterrent. So it's a game of bluff, essentially, isn't it? Which I'm sure you could explain maybe further. So to explain it, to teach it to undergrads, I'd use clips from Dr. Strangelove, or Why I Love to Learn, How I Learned to Love the Atomic Bomb by Kubrick. And applying it to education came because a friend of mine who works in digital pedagogy at Nottingham, he recommended this text by James Cars called Finite and Infinite Games from 1986, a theologian and historian, kind of pithy aphoristic text. And I read it. I actually read it last year, and I was like, well, that's fine. That's fine. It's interesting, and didn't think too much to it again. And then I think was it earlier this year. I don't know what happened, but I finished one. I know what happened, and can't remember exactly when. But it was early this year, so I'd already read it, and I didn't think too much to it. It was fine, an interesting book. Didn't think too much again. That was last Christmas time, and then I encountered it, and then I finished an ebook. I can't remember what it was, but I finished one book, and then it just popped up as I previously read. It just kind of popped up, and I was just drawn to an excerpt on that page, and then I found myself going back into it, which is very curious because I kind of didn't have any problems with it, but I just reread it, and the context in which I read it, I think this was about April, May time, after I'd just been to a conference. And something on that page just struck me as worthy of further explanation. So of exploration. So I went and read the text again. And as we were entering the summer season and we were marking and it was leading up to graduation, and students get highly pressurized and they start to become a lot more instrumental when the stakes are much higher in the game of education and their degrees. So particularly my final years were really kind of wanting to pass what was happening in class from what was going to be needed for their assessment, final point assessment of their 3-year degree, and what wasn't. And I think that's why and the context matters, right? So I read it in the Christmas holidays first, this book, when I'm in more of a relaxed state, I guess, the holiday mode. And then I'm reading it now when my students are in this heightened state of anxiety, and it resonated with me in a different way. And that's when I thought, okay, let me apply it to the context of higher education, because he doesn't do that in the text necessarily, only in passing. And that in May time, I remember now, I did a literature search on how it had been applied, and it hadn't really been applied in engineering circles. You'd expect game theory and this kind of stuff to be applied in things like engineering or computing, given the kind of proclivities of those disciplines, but not really in the humanities. And that's when I wrote a piece for Wonky on rethinking higher education. If graduation is the telos, if graduating and the ceremony, which it quite literally is the telic goal, the endpoint, in a grand setting as well, with the robes and all the kind of pomp and kind of everything that goes around it, I just felt it was an opportune moment to apply this theory to the game of higher education.
So if we were to kind of like use the two terms I mentioned earlier, the finite game and the infinite game, what would your conception of like what these two things look like in higher education? So what is a finite game, for example, if you apply it to higher education?
I think so. It's instrumental. So it's outcome based. It's outcome oriented rather than process oriented. Of course, the two are dialectically related, but it's when a student says, okay, is this going to be in the assessment? What am I being assessed on? It's looking at the rubric. It's looking at how to win a grade, how to win a high mark. And there's a lot of literature. There's burgeoning literature right now on the topic of ungrading, which is getting a lot of traction about undoing grading, or kind of reducing the emphasis on grades in favor of feedback and narrative feedback and ongoing feedback. So that would be kind of finite games, literally playing to get the grade for the assessment point. I've seen students show me sometimes they've got these Excel spreadsheets they've made. They've seen how much each assessment is worth in percentile status of their degree. When it's due, they've mapped the whole thing out. It's quite impressive. I am quite impressed with the diligence and the kind of tactics taking place here. So I've seen a student, and first year has done this, seeing, okay, this is 70%, so this has got more of a weighting than the other assessment, so I need to put more stock into this, and looking at everything in a very instrumental, clearly finite basis, because we've got deadlines. I mean, the word deadline is quite scary. Death is is very finite when you're talking about death. An infinite game would be something, and when pressed to think of this before today's conversation, I was thinking of processes that I've been part of, and I'm sure there's things that you could think of too, where it wasn't based on the outcome. We were doing it voluntarily. It was a kind of, so there was no assessment. So one thing that comes to mind, and maybe and again, content matters here. So it was a non-Western philosophy reading group at Cardiff. So we'd meet on Wednesday afternoons, lunchtime, the typical time when you do your society stuff. So there wasn't any timetable teaching, and a group of us would come together and we'd read things like the Dhammapada by the Buddha, or Nagarjuna, or the Indic Vedic philosophy, and it was purely for intellectual inquiry. And it was just reading, discussion. We read the Tao Te Ching and how hard it is to translate to a Western context. These kind of different ideas, and that was blissful. It was really, and that was definitely infinite. I mean, the content, we're talking about highfalutin Eastern philosophies that are all about the kind of paradox of existence. So I guess the content matched the fact that this was an infinite game. But something more kind of, let's say, in the Western European tradition. I remember in my second year I was studying 2 modules on European fiction and European cinema, and they went deep into psychoanalysis and narrative. And the assessment, you could have been very strategic and watched basically one film all semester, and you could have just written the assignment, if you wanted to game it, and many people did. I found myself just right in there. And again, I think I'm thinking aloud now, the content matters here. You're talking about psychoanalysis, you're talking about Eastern philosophies and mysticism. These things, I think, lend themselves to a much more slower, infinite kind of process, because there is no answer to be had. There's no, and when you're looking at psychoanalysis in film, it's about trying to understand one's neuroses, but there's no finite goal or winning or end point.
Mm.
And I think, thinking aloud now, yeah, I think the content certainly matters to what it is you're trying to do here. But that said, you can go to any university in the land, and I teach on the theology modules here. We teach these concepts and these kind of highfalutin Eastern ideas of non-self and so on, but we still assess students' ability to write about them. So it's not like they're immune from the finite game, these things.
Yeah. Before we kind of, I suppose, get into that, a bit more in a moment, I suppose like the first thing I would think about is, to my understanding, the infinite game is basically the game itself is about staying in the game rather than kind of finishing the game, which makes it finite. And I suppose, like, when I listen to people talk about game theory applied in business, I can kind of see that being something that is possible. But then when it comes to education, I suppose, like, what I'm trying to sort of ponder is how would that look? You can't stay in. Well, I suppose you could probably argue that you could stay in education forever, but then I suppose we don't live forever. But so what would that actually look like practically for someone trying to play an infinite game instead of finite game in education?
I think it's like, again, drawing upon Western philosopher who looked a lot at Eastern traditions, Alan Watts. He said, like, life is like a game of basketball. Your whole purpose is to get the ball and to pass it to another player so that the game continues, so that you can't stand still and stop. A couple of bounces, it moves on. And I think, like that with intellectual inquiry, we build on the shoulders of giants. So in terms of the game of education, be it physics or philosophy or education, where theories are built on previous theories, so social constructivism responds to behaviorism, etc. Social constructivism responds to cognitive constructivism of Piaget, etc., etc. And new theories emerge. We're dealing a lot with post-humanism right now, or whatever will be the new debate. And so we have a debt, I think, intellectual debt to our forebearers. And so, in terms of education, the goal is not to solve the riddle of life or existence in one's finite lifetime, but is to continue to ask the right kinds of questions. And those who come after you will continue those questions. And that's why we're talking and we're reading things that were written or maybe spoken 2,500 years ago, which is still a drop in the ocean of, even within human existence, which is still a drop in the ocean of a bigger ocean. So I think education is inextricably linked to this process of continuing inquiry. I mean, if you look at the hard sciences, the kind of, if you bring a real hardline positivist and looking at kind of correlation between what you do and real world application, I mean, the hard sciences are all based on um, circling back to those who've come before you and reworking theories. Think of Einstein building on Newton, and you think of where we are now in terms of string theory, and it's going to continue it's going to continue. Excuse the pun here, ad infinitum, right? So that's I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that level of infinity, or paradoxic infinity, because we are finite beings, and our species is finite. That's the paradox. The education within that, it's just a journey that continues, and then we pass on to those that come after us.
Okay, yeah. So where did it all come from in terms of like the ideology of it, I suppose, is my question, rather than sort of how did you stumble across this particular topic, but why do you care about it?
Why do I care about it? I care about it in today's context, where we are incredibly instrumental and outcomes based, right? So we are metric driven culture. Someone as famous as Brian Cox, the scientist, an ex-musician, and if he still plays music, but will say something. He's a hardline materialist. If it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. It's kind of drawing upon this legacy in the last 100 years of logical positivism of British philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, who was not British, but for all intents and purposes thought in that mold, who believe that concepts like such as God or beauty or aesthetics, they're not really worth investigating, because they don't exist. So what we need to do is have a correlation theory between what we can see, touch, like kind of hardline empiricism, and understand our material world. And that's how things can get better, right? And that's such a impoverished way of looking at human existence. I think poetry, metaphysics, that which is beyond physics, the ineffable, the aesthetic realm, music, these things are highly emotive, powerful kind of creations of the species. And I think my again, I read the. It's so important to mention that I read the book last Christmas. Thought, yeah, that's great, and then threw it, put it aside. Didn't think too much of it again, and it's because of the context within being at a time when those around me, colleagues and students alike, are highly stressed, working towards deadlines, marking, presenting, moderating, and we're in this kind of, we're in this rigmarole, this kind of machine or this rat race, and it's like just step back and realize what we're doing here, and kind of the academic burnout is such a prevalent issue. Academic suicide's an issue for staff and students alike. These are not trivial concerns. These are real serious life or death matters. And so it's a case of taking stock and going, okay, to what end are we working so hard to achieve a measurable outcome? Like, be it, at the universities currently, and I've got colleagues that work incredibly hard, and yourself included, we've all worked very hard to get like TEF recognition, teaching excellence framework, and then it'll be the ref, and then it could be the KEF, the knowledge exchange rate, and then it'll be insert an NSS, it's DBA, death by acronym, and it doesn't end, and it doesn't end, but it's self-inflicted. It's self-inflicted as an industry, as a group of organizations. We're on what, not, I haven't coined this phrase, but someone else in academia called it a treadmill of justification. And if you think of that beautiful metaphor of a treadmill, you might be getting fitter on a treadmill, but you're going nowhere for one. You're static. You get fitter, I'm sure your cardiovascular endurance will increase, but you get nowhere, and eventually you will burn out. And as you may know, if you're running on a treadmill, when you actually go to run the road or on grass, people get injured because they're not adapted to the actual vagaries of the actual material and rain and wind. It's one thing to run on a treadmill in a confined kind of artificial space, but once you go out into the quote unquote natural real world, the elements will hit you by surprise. And I think in higher education, I think that's a wonderful metaphor. It does a lot of work because that's what we're doing. We're working really hard towards ends. And I think, in our context at BG, we've got a new change of leadership. And one of the things that the new person has said is to say, well, take stock of what you're doing and ask yourself, is this process necessary? And maybe kind of do so. And I don't know enough about the new leadership yet, but that sentiment is something I could get on board with, to say, well, what you're doing, why are you doing it? Why does it need to be done this way? And so that's where I was drawn to this notion of finitude and infinity, to create a shortcut way, which of course has got its limitations and it's somewhat crude, because any binary distinction is going to be crude by definition. But it helps to, in a quick elevator pitch way, articulate, here's where we are, here's the trajectory we're on, and here's what we could offer as a counterpoint to that.
So how would you go about convincing somebody who's, we're all playing this game, which most of us, I suppose by that definition, we're playing a finite game to try to win whatever that we're trying to win.
Yeah.
So if everybody's in that game, and trying to win, or at least not lose, I suppose.
Yeah.
How would you be able to convince them, to say, actually, you need to stop and take stock of what you're doing, and so basically, you can then play a different game or not play the game at all, when everyone else is playing that game, and so then you end up by default being a loser anyway.
Yeah, I think it's to get out of the winners and losers paradigm. I think it's to eschew that kind of narrative. If you're seeing it like that way, you're good. That level of implication, you're a dunner. You're gone for. I think it's the desire to play that different game. So once you recognize what you're doing, Theodor Adorno, a social philosopher from Germany, who was a Jewish intellectual, had to leave Germany during Second World War for obvious reasons, returned to his homeland. And during the student protests of the 60s, he said, he was speaking to his students, and he said, you can do things slightly differently. And the turn of phrase he used was, again, going back to sports. I don't know why these sports metaphors used, because that's games as well, isn't it? Basketball. He said, you can put the baton down, So in a relay race, just he goes, no histrionics, no kind of, don't need to blow yourself up. Just take the baton and just quietly put it on the floor. And then the others will look at you like you might be crazy, you might be mad or something like that, but they'll stop running as well. And then you're like, okay, well, we don't need to do this. Because if you think again, the race, running around a track or putting hurdles in front of you, the artificial constructs that don't have to be there. If it's a case of running from A to B as fast as you can, then pump yourself full of every drug known to humankind and do it as quickly as you can. But we create artificial constructs to see what else we can do, like literal hurdles. So in an academic context, it's a case of, by all means, carry on as you are. I'm not here to preach or to tell anyone to do anything differently. And I certainly, of course, I'm still part of this machination, and I play the game, and I mark, and I moderate, and I moderate, and I do validation processes, and I'm by no means in a robe looking down on everyone else, thinking, oh, you lot are doing this game, and I'm holier than that. Absolutely not. I'm in inextricably linked as much as everyone else, I think. But my challenge, or my kind of my offer through CAST and through other kind of thinkers that I've drawn upon in my research, is to say things can be done ever so slightly differently. You don't have to always do it this way. We can just take a breather here. We can actually stop. Um, and in doing so, we have a lot of power, in higher education as well. We set the dial for narratives that, around the nation. In fact, higher education, just very small incremental things that I've seen I started teaching in higher education in 2012. And in the last decade, the rampant use of certain types of language going unchecked is something that I'm kind of rallying against by providing this different narrative. One very quick and cut and dry example will be saying how we talk about other universities such as Lincoln, or those near us, Nottingham or Anglia Ruskin. We talk about them as our competitors because they're our market competitors. And that language did not exist 15, 20 years ago. And I never heard that. But the businessification of higher education and the language that's used, of course, with the introduction of student fees, etc., there's been, and I'm not saying it was some sort of holy land before and it was all kind of some utopian world in higher education, but in the last 20 years and 10 years since I've been teaching, the casual use of such language is something that has gone unchecked, I think. So I'm just saying, maybe we should stop to take pause for thought with the language we're using and how we actually see ourselves, our notion of self-concept. Those are our competitors. They're taking money away from us. That's a really interesting and not unproblematic way to see other places of higher education, which we should be theoretically collaborating with, and knowledge exchange, and creating a better society for all of us.
So in light of all of this kind of neoliberal movements that we've seen, as clearly is the reason for the kind of competition, I suppose, that you mentioned, apart from just the change of language or the kind of consideration that we can have when it comes to the use of language, what would be a step that you think is practical that people can take when it comes to sort of thinking, or reframing the way that we look at it?
I'm not good at practical. I'm better at intellectual navel gazing. That's my bag as a theoretical philosopher. So I ask the questions. I'll leave it to others to figure out the answers. But in terms of practicality, let me. I'm obviously being a bit facetious, but in terms of negotiating the theory practice divide, I will offer this: the fact that we can have this conversation, or the fact that someone might listen to this and take pause for thought and go, I didn't think of it that way. Or maybe think, okay, maybe I could do something a bit different. Maybe I don't have to put so much goddamn pressure on myself to achieve a particular outcome, or to achieve a particular benchmark against which to measure myself, be it student or staff. Just the fact that, to be able to normalize that narrative, again, I come from the corporate world, right? I think that's an important thing, that those echoes are still there in me somehow, even though I left it a long time ago. I come from that world. And okay, and it's this is 2 years ago. It's worth sharing this anecdote. My wife, my partner, I called her my wife. That was a Freudian slip. My partner, who's not my wife, who's my partner, who's not my wife. She was heavily pregnant with our soon-to-be child in 2 years ago, March, and we had a friendly game of Monopoly, which I played with my, quasi in-laws. They're not my in-laws, but her parents. And I haven't played Monopoly in 15 years. And what Monopoly is about. The game of Monopoly is buying properties and putting people out of their livelihoods and making them bankrupt. And I come from the world of Bloomberg and PwC long time ago. That's how I grew up, as a migrant Indian Punjabi family in the UK. It's about making money. It's about making money and status. We watched Only Fools and Horses every weekend. That's going to be a millionaire. And so this stuff is there. It's deeply encoded within my kind of DNA. So playing Monopoly, I turned into the Antichrist. I was just, my partner's mother said, he is ruthless. Without Ruth, he is, she was saying. She just couldn't believe my partner was scared to have a child with me. So I say all this as a kind of somewhat humorous anecdote, but to say that, see, the context matters, and what's normalized matters. So if that's what's celebrated, an apprentice culture, a kind of, hyper Love Island dating culture and so on, a crass material culture, where human beings are reduced to kind of, status items, to inform your sense of self or to sell yourself better. LinkedIn, whatever, Facebook, Instagram, insert here, right? This is like hyper visibility that didn't exist even 15, 20 years ago when I started university, or was in the corporate world. But just slipping into playing something as innocuous as Monopoly brought out the devil in me. But at the same, so I have to work very hard to kind of put aside those kind of sensibilities. But by the same token, exposing oneself to a more kinder, compassionate, infinite game logic brings out a better side of me, a more vulnerable, open-ended, kind of generative side of me, where I'm not looking to dominate or win or compete. So this is, but I'm kind of self-disclosing a bit too much here. But I say all that to suggest what the practical tool of this for someone else would be, who maybe isn't even as kind of naturally as anti-Christ-like as I am by my background, and who can work in those industries, is to go easy on yourself and actually to reframe how you fit and realize. I mean, the genius of neoliberalism is that it individualizes social problems. That's the genius of it. It makes you feel like you're inadequate and that the world around you is beautifully set up and that you're just not good enough. One of my favorite philosophers, Jiddu Krishnamurti, said, and I love this quote, it's so pithy. He said, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So just take stock of what's going on around you, and realize that you, in getting caught up in that storm, you may win, but the problem with the rat race is that even if you win, you're still a rat. So, and I don't want to do down rats, because rats are really intelligent creatures, but I mean, it's just to know that there's even another option. And most people don't know that. They think, no, I have to drive and push myself harder. I need to go more. And for someone to put a kind arm on your shoulder and say, you don't have to, actually. You can slow down. You can take stock and observe, and you don't have to do what you think you ought to have to do. And if you want to go on and work in stocks and trades, then by all means continue. There's going to be plenty of people doing that, but you don't have to. And I think to be given, and for me, again, you can't separate biography and autobiography from these kind of emotive concerns. But coming from a migrant family, coming from that kind of immigrant journey, where it is about status and it is about money and it is about security and it is about scarcity, it takes a lot of undoing to look at that and go, actually, those are relics of a bygone era. Those aren't necessary anymore.
Okay, so I suppose there are two things I kind of wanted to ask you about that, really. The first thing is, when it comes to finite games, I suppose a lot of people probably would kind of associate those games with, like, they give you motivation, drive, so there is a purpose of why you're doing something, and you can see the outcomes, which would allow you to kind of, I suppose, take on more games, and just to kind of get to the next thing. So without that kind of notion of being in a finite game where you can see the outcome and to be able to win or succeed in some way, how would somebody be able to kind of keep up that motivation to be productive, whatever that means, for whoever it is that who's listening to this?
Krishnamurti has a good question. He says, what's the state of your mind? What is the state of your mind when you're no longer looking for an answer? So it's a kind of almost like a Zen koan. What is the state of your mind when you're no longer looking for an answer? And that's the infinite way of looking at it. It's like it's questioning the questioner. What is it you're looking to achieve here? I'm not doing down the value of finite games at all. I think they're incredibly useful. I think, I'm raising a small child, and that's as finite, as real as it gets. It's very hands-on material, if you know what I mean. So, and there have to be kind of milestones or goals or things you do, day-to-day processes. And I think finitude is important because it obviously injects a sense of urgency or kind of sense of prioritization of certain tasks. And I think it would be naive and just completely naively romantic to say we should do away with finitude, or the notion of finitude, beings on towards death, as Heidegger would have it. We're finite beings. But my proposition, building on cars, is that because we are so implicated in that logic, that we begin to see even I've used it there. We begin to see every interaction as a transaction. So everything becomes instrumental. I'll do this, even a conversation like this, which is talking about these concepts, becomes part of a wider project of maybe sharing something or using it for students as a resource. And I'm not doing down then that the value of those things. I'd like people to be able to hear these things and use them. But I mean, there was one guy, I can't remember, he wrote a book about critiquing this kind of rampant productivity kind of hype we have at the moment. And I can't remember the book, forgive me, but he said he caught himself one day brushing his teeth while rearranging his socks in the drawer. And he said, this is insanity. And he said there's a reason why I'm doing that, because time is money, right? That metaphor where I'm brushing my teeth and I can't even brush my teeth anymore, with this gentleman said, without feeling the need to do something else or have a podcast on or something at the same time. It's just it's implicated in our very fabric of how we are as a society at the moment. And to answer your question directly, I think it's important to have finite games, absolutely, to feel like you've got somewhere to see, somewhere you're going somewhere. Someone who's swimming, learning to swim 50 meters, which is quite, literally a measured distance and so on. Picking an arbitrary brick out at the bottom of the swimming pool is a test to see whether you can deep dive and collect something. And driving tests, etc. These things are important. If you can't just have anyone just saying, I'm in an infinite game as they're driving along and doing whatever they want on the road. But there needs to be some structure in order for civilization to work. I don't contest that one bit. I think the value of the infinite game, or the necessity of it in today's discourse, is because we don't live in we don't live in a society that privileges that at all. It privileges go 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 go, but we're seeing what it's doing to people's mental health. It's student, staff, across sectors. People are struggling. People are struggling. It's not, I don't think it's like we hear the word about growth. We need to grow. We need more. It's like, you keep growing, you will hit. You're gonna die. Like, you can't grow you can't grow exponentially. There is a limit to growth, and it's very strange. When I was in business meetings and so on, no one ever says, maybe we've got enough. Maybe we just consolidate where we are, and just because if you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards, and all that narrative. It's like people double down on becoming more and more aggressive. And working in the city, you've seen this in kind of extreme forms and in film and so on. I've seen things in day-to-day life, and I've seen the amount of drug use that goes on in the city as well. People to keep going. Where taking a break or taking a nap or a rest is seen as kind of soft. This is the kind of people that set the agenda from top down in the city of London. So that kind of logic trickles its way down.
So to what extent, though, do you feel like this is just a kind of counterculture movement, to that kind of toxic productivity sort of narrative, rather than it being something that we really want to kind of move towards? Is it a reaction, basically? Is it a reaction rather than like some kind of ideological position that we want to be in?
Well, it's like the laws of physics. I think that it's all about balance, isn't it? Our bodies are looking for homeostasis. They're constantly looking for homeostasis. If you drink too much or eat too much sugar, there'll be a come down and so on. So just like the human bioorganism looking for homeostasis, for balance, as a society, in terms of our narratives, I think that's necessary as well. We have a polarized right and a polarized left right now, to a degree, which is the quote unquote, as you said, the word cultural reaction. We're going through a culture wars, aren't we, where people can't seem to meet in the middle and have healthy discourse and debate. I think this is a proposition that is definitely countercultural against the kind of hegemonic way we're doing things, of this kind of go neoliberal culture, which again is not an old thing. It's a very modern discourse. It started in the 1930s as a kind of obscure school of economics, and it really took off in only the late 70s, 80s. So it's a very new project. It's not something that our parents' generation even grew up with. They grew up they grew up in a welfare state, where Keynesian economics was a kind of norm. So this is a very new social project on a mass scale, which we're going through the ramifications of. And this, I would argue, this would be labeled, as you rightly put it, as a quote unquote countercultural movement, or kind of minority position. And I have no truck with that whatsoever. That's perfectly fine. But in terms of an ideology that we would like to ascribe to regardless, I think that it's somewhat, I think that's a bit, I think that's slightly how do I say, skewed way to look at it. Is because any discourse happens within a context, and then there's always a dialectic at work. So you wouldn't have this and there wasn't something to react to. And likewise, if we were all living like monks, in playing an infinite game, there'd be some monks who are like, I want a nice car. Do you know what I mean? So that same thing would happen, if we were living in a monastery, and there'll be some people that want material gain, which there, of course, are people leave monasteries for those very reasons. People leave communism because they want to acquire capitalist wealth, right? So I think that's just the way of existence, to be honest.
Because suppose I want one of the, what some people might say is that, to counter this narrative of some sort of toxic productivity
Yeah.
is that some people say actually want to do things. I want to play these games. I get something from it, and if I'm enjoying what I'm doing, what does it matter to people whether or not I worked 23 hours a day? That kind of thing. And so what do you think to that? Is it like an individual thing where it's kind of down to the individual to decide what's best for them, but in general, because there is there is a lot of problems going on in terms of people not being happy in terms of the way that they're that they're working too hard, and so it's just a way for them to kind of reframe their situation. So do you think like it's something that everybody should kind of take stock, or is it just one of those things that it's for the individuals to decide whatever is best for them?
Yeah, it's the latter, of course. Of course. I mean, if someone had come to me as an 18, 19-year-old and told me about infinite games and the value of slowing down, you can't tell an 18-year-old that who wants to make money and work in a city. It's just it's all context and life stages. I'm entering middle age now, literally entering the middle of my life. So I'm now at a time where it's time to look back and you can change your ways, So it's all contextual. It's not something, it's not a universal, it's not something, but going back to your notion about being countercultural, what is universal in scope, or what seems to be pressed upon us as a society or individuals within that? To go back to, would I impart this and say it's a must to take stock and so on? No, it's definitely optional and it's definitely context based. But you see, the context in which I'm responding actually doesn't grant us that. It makes an injunction and says you must do this. You must be, get good grades, go to good university, get a quote unquote good job, do this, make money, blah blah blah. So that discourse seems to that's why it's hegemonic. It's that's why it's power is invisible in that regard, because it just is the prevalent narrative. And I wouldn't by any means say that this should be necessary or anything like that. It's one of the tenets of the infinite game is that it's completely voluntary. You enter and you leave at any point. You enter this way of being, this, maybe I can never pronounce the name, Csikszentmihalyi would call like a flow state or a different way of doing activities. Yeah, Csikszentmihalyi, the late kind of, how do you put him, psychologist, who talked about the popularized notion of flow. And he said something in a quasi-Marxist tone. He said the future will not belong to the person who knows how to use their work time, but who knows how to use their leisure time. That was 20 years ago. Think of I go back to my gentleman who's brushing his teeth, sorting his socks, because he's been so conditioned and programmed in the node of more, and productivity and efficiency, that I think that quote often comes to me, just going for a walk without thinking I need to count, literally is what we do, isn't it? I'm not even being funny here. We literally count steps because we've gamified walking. 10,000 a day, right? Whatever it is. Like, even something as innocuous as just going for a walk in the woods has become part of a bigger notion of a metric culture, which is quite frankly, in some ways, it's almost scary to think that that's like normal. That's not even seen as weird anymore. That's just seen as normal. People have these I don't wear one, as you can imagine, but people have those devices on their wrists that tell them their heart rate, how they slept at night, how many bowel movements they've had in the last day. It's just it's metrics gone mad, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think certainly there's a lot of that going on in terms of like gamification, like you said, and I suppose that part of it potentially is like some business probably see the potential of using gamification as a way to motivate people.
Yes.
To kind of, I suppose, be part of that movement of commercialize everything, that sort of thing. And I suppose like that leads me to the question of if gaming could potentially be a problem in that sense, would it not just be better to not game rather than thinking about finite games or infinite games? Why don't we just not bother with games?
We're a game playing species, I think. I'm not a behavioral psychologist, I've only dabbled in it. But I think if you ask what is the purpose of our species, again, depends whether you're religious. I mean, Cast was a theologian, so he's coming at it from a theological point of view about narrative. What is it, the story we tell ourselves as a species? I don't know. I'm not I've read too much Nietzsche to believe in anything. So I'm not a believer in any theological sense. But what is the purpose of our species? I think we're here to create. I think that's what we do, be it music or art or when I say art, I mean that in the kind of real umbrella term: visual, musical, and paintings, etc., etc. Drama. I think we're a creative species. I think we're a playful species. I think primates do that as well. You see primates play, even octopi play. We don't know what octopi are. They're really weird, aren't they? They're just so fascinating, our octopi. We could learn a lot from them. And I think that is not going to leave us. I think we're always playing some sort of game. We're always playing some sort of game. Even the meditator plays a game because they're playing a game within themselves. When they sit and they try to meditate and get out of the gameplay, they're playing the game to not play the game. So you can't escape the game. It's just, I think it's part of who we are as a species.
Yeah. So based on your conceptualization of, game theory and how it can be applied in education, do you think it is possible, and I think I probably know the answer to this, but do you think it's possible to have finite games within the infinite games that, that might be going on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, how would you best answer that question?
I think it could be, if you individually, I suppose you can be playing finite games that would form part of an infinite game as part of the education, itself, and the evolution of education. But as you mentioned earlier, we're all finite beings ourselves.
Yeah.
We can't really play an infinite game in the technically.
Yeah.
And so I suppose, we are limited to playing finite games, but as part of the infinite, a bigger game, a bigger movement of some sort that will outlast you and everyone else around you, that kind of thing. But how would you apply that to anybody listening who are working in a different sector? For example, like in a school environment, I suppose, they face quite a lot of similar challenges as people working in higher education, but I guess in some sense the games that they're having to kind of play, both in terms of the practitioners as well as the children who are in those sectors, are probably playing, at the very least, I would say, more higher stakes game, rather than maybe like whether it's more or less, but they are playing higher stakes games because of what kind of consequences or implications all of the results or the outcomes would lead to. So yeah, how would you sort of advise someone to think about, to reframe, or to take stock of being in that situation?
I'll try my best. I'm not the best person for that. Like I said, I don't do practical. I do theoretical navel gazing. Without thinking about real world consequences, quote unquote. No, but to school teachers, so I haven't got a temperament to work in a school, as you can probably imagine. So those who are working in a school, in a state apparatus or an academy setting, or where it's all outcome based, where it's preparing children for essentially assessment, right? It's all kind of doctored towards assessment. When you study an education studies degree at BG, for example, we look at what underpins policy, and where policy doesn't come in a vacuum, and what ideologically drives policy. And we look at other different ways of doing things. We look at different comparative examples. So we look at China and the testing system there, or we look at Finland and the more humanistic approach there. I would lean, obviously, as you can probably imagine, more to Scandinavian models such as Denmark and Finland and places like that. Not so much Sweden, which is kind of basically half neoliberal anyway, private kind of low cost free schools, kind of paradox. But the Finnish model, like taking away the kind of pressure on assessment, allowing children to grow at their own pace without putting pressure on them at much earlier years. The EYFS was and has been a quite progressive document within the kind of policy machine of UK state education, based on Reggio Emilia approaches, kind of Malaguzzi's approach about child-centered learning, inquiry-based learning. But even that's going to be slightly eroded and done away with now as we prepare children for year 2 SATs. So the advice I would give to practitioners within those fields, and who maybe know about those who understand the political underpinnings of these policies and the injunctions of top down, is you can leave. is one, right? To leave, no, to leave. That's why the dropout rates are so high. And I know you've spoken to Mark Larard about retention rates in Spain and how teachers are afforded a different status there as civil servants and how they have a status within the community. So we really need to rethink what the function of civic education is in this country. I mean, that's a given. For those who know and are trying to survive within the machinations of the education machine, which it is obviously with injunctions, it's very hard. It's very hard. It's very hard to know what you're doing and what, because you're basically a functionary. You're there as a functionary of the state to administer top-down level protocol, right, and to uh, share certain types of knowledge, right, that are deemed as more worthy than others. It's very hard to know that and to do it while still exercising compassion, concern, and care for every child and differentiating. It's extremely taxing. And we're always going to have people that want to become teachers. We're going to have people with that disposition. And until that those people that work on the grounds are able to inform policy from bottom up more, it's going to be a very, very troubled arena, unfortunately. I don't see the future as being anything but even more challenging for the teaching sector, mainstream education sector, schooling sector in this country. What we can do for hope, though, is to look to models of more humanistic approaches like Finland, where countries are literally raising children where, they can't read and write by the age of 8, but they outperform our youngsters at age 16. So if you want to talk about winning and gaming, and you want to talk about outcomes at 16, well, they're still doing better than us. And yet we're putting all this pressure on 7, 8-year-olds to perform, to rote learning, to test. So even by the logic of that game, if you want better outcomes at 16 and so on, then look to those schools. And if you want to look locally, the schools that get the best results are obviously private schools, right? We know that. But if you look to even the gentleman I mentioned, Krishnamurti, there's a school in his name in Hampshire called Brockwood, which I've been to visit, and it's a humanistic inquiry-based learning approach with very kind of slow pace and student-led learning throughout the ages, democratic education that they've got in Modrogon in Spain as well. And the outcomes are fantastic. They all go into universities and they go everywhere. But you can't divorce the fact that the people that go to those schools have social and economic capital. So regardless of whether they went to that school or not, they're probably going to do all right in life anyway. So there are exemplars such as independent schools, your Steiner schools, your the alternative Reggio Emilia approaches, which the EYFS, like I said, did take heed of. It took heed of the Reggio Emilia approach and it incorporated it within its policies. So there are elements of that there, but that seems to be even more aggressively being responded to. It's saying we need to set the children up to a lifetime of competition and hard fight, and if we don't do that at an early age, we're setting them up to fail. But that's borderline sadism, right? It's like saying we want them to know. It's like I was speaking to colleague Adam about that this recently. Adam Hanslower, head of education studies, saying you continue by that logic of that game. Well, you're not, and again, indulge me here for a minute, or point the finger and say, no, I've gone too far here. Once you start looking at it by that logic, then you take it further, and you could take it right down to the level of eugenics. Actually, you can take it right down to the level of in utero. Well, this child needs to be set up, and if the parents have got a low IQ, then this child's not going to get anywhere in life. We need to set our children up for the best future possible and make sure that they're prepared. Otherwise, it's cruelty to the child. I mean, forgive me if I'm being a bit too melodramatic here, but we've seen this happen in the not too recent past, and we continue to see designer babies as an ethical problem around the world now. So when you're putting that much pressure, it's not something that's going to go away easily. And I know teachers and such good people and the students we have at BG as well, caring, kind, really hardworking people, feeling sometimes helpless and hapless. It's and it's not their fault. It's really not their shortcoming and not being a good enough teacher. What advice could I give them? I mean, I am so badly placed for that because I can't hack it. I wouldn't be able to hack it myself. I can't have hacked it myself. But just know that there are alternative models out there, and and some students I've taught at BG before have gone on to work in policy. They've gone on to work for educational charities. They've gone on to work in support services. They've gone to do things that suit their temperament more. And if you have a temperament where you can go into the machination machine of mainstream education and still do it, then all power to you. Some people got that temperament. Some people have got that. think of that whole logic of the Teach First program. You remember the Teach First program, which was, now they set up people to work as teachers in rough schools, but before it was all about 2 years in a rough school and then going on to work in banking or in the army or something like that, seen as a kind of using these children as cannon fodder for your kind of working in tough environments.
Mm.
So even regardless of, there are people of the temperament that want to join things like Teach First and go into rough schools and play Dangerous Minds, play Michelle Pfeiffer. And if you want to do that, and you've got the temperament, it makes for good viewing.
Yeah. So okay then. So in terms of, because what you're saying, because you mentioned earlier how you see this isn't going to go away in terms of the gamification of things, and things being intensified because of many different reasons. And I think that leads me to kind of the idea of agency and what real agency that we have really as practitioners, because obviously it would probably be quite naive to think we could change the world just like,
Yeah.
if we want to, and we can't just go and change a policy because we don't like it or we don't think it's going to do us good in the long run. And so what agency do we really have, from your perspective?
You look at history, if you look throughout history, how things change, and where we are now, the fact that you and I are in this country right now, not being persecuted because of our ethnic difference and so on and so forth, right? Things have gotten ostensibly better on the face of it. We know that, right? And things go up and down, right? We've seen kind of a right-wing reaction in this country as well. So how do things get better? How can things change? And we can't change a policy overnight, of course not. But it's the one thing that's always worked in history, and it's one thing that I'm going to say now, it's collective action, right? It's collective bargaining, it's collective action. It's enough people. When you have a critical mass, and there's enough of a retort to something. If you look at any country throughout civilization, um, under the times of feudalism, people couldn't imagine anything different, could they? Feudalism was the only game in town. That's why Marx loves capitalism so much. In a weird way, he says it's all that is solid melts into air. He calls it the Promethean force that's going to drive us to a kind of post-capital society. We're not there yet, anywhere near. Yeah. But my answer to the question is consciousness raising, so awareness raising in the Hegelian sense, right? So knowledge, having these conversations, discussing things, realizing that first of all, you are not a problem as a human being. Like, you are not a problem. You are playing a game, and you might do that through your culture or your enculturation or your programming, as it were, how you felt you ought to get ahead in life. Like, taking stock, having conversations, normalizing different paradigms, recognizing that neoliberalism doesn't have to be the only game in town. It's a very new game in town, and we seem to have forgotten any other game ever existed. So just recognizing that there are different ways to do things, and you can put down the baton, and having these discussions or having conversations and normalizing things, and not feeling that you have to go at 120 miles an hour all the time. Is part of that process. And for those who want to do that and continue in that vein, and goodness me, I need people that can work 14-hour days, people that surgeons and first responders, people have certain temperaments, people are wired in different ways, people have energy at different times of the day and so on. Thankfully we have enough diversity within our human population for people to do different things. And I would never say to a person, don't do something if you want to. But for those, but as a critical mass, we are, I think we're going in one direction, and it's not leading to healthy outcomes by any measure, if you want to measure things.
So thinking back to higher education, what does your idealistic infinite version of higher education look like?
That's the whole series of podcasts. The thing. Okay, here's my offer, and it's a very radical one. Is to do away with the awarding of degrees and ceremonies and graduation completely. It's to have higher education as an arena where people come and go as they choose to do modules or to study something that they're interested in. A bit like how lifelong learning works in like centers of top universities, where you can, or study a MOOC. People would study a MOOC on, I don't know, Hinduism in the 21st century or something, and they do a course accredited by the University of Oxford, and they could have that as their finite game. So they'd have that on their CV that they've done a 30-credit module with the University of Oxford on this concept. And MOOCs were going to be a big thing about a decade ago, weren't they? And they kind of died a death, it seems. But it would be to have a voluntary in and out system of education where you can learn something you want to learn, But you don't necessarily have to do a 3-year pathway. You don't have to necessarily do, and you could maybe like a bit like the Open University model, which exists and is the biggest university in the country, where you can go in and you can do different things. You have elective modules, like in the Scottish model, or in what I had in Cardiff, where I could do optional modules in my first year, the American model. So affording a great deal of flexibility to have a lot more kind of coming and going in and out of higher education, a space for real intellectual inquiry and yeah, pushing ideas forward and a coming and going, much more flux rather than people signed up to, however much laden with student debt to do a 3-year degree in the hope that they might achieve a certain outcome. Do away with it. I mean, this is completely radical and it's never going to happen in a million years anytime soon. But if you ask me the question, that's my answer. My answer is to be so people come together in open-hearted voluntary discourse that they want to come and they want to study about. I want to learn about social constructivism, or I want to learn about anatomy and physiology, and it works in that mode of in and out. And people come at different ages, not such strict entry requirements and so on, just a willingness to learn.
Fascinating, honestly. Again, we could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah,
but anyway, I think it's got to the point. I suppose one last thing I was going to ask you is, for those people who are really interested in this particular topic and how they could apply potentially some of the ideas that you've talked about today, would you recommend any particular sources, text, that kind of thing for them to have a look at?
I'll say they can email me. So they can contact me. There's very little literature on this. Having done a literature review on who's used Carter's work, I mean, we're talking about 4 journal articles really in the last 30 years. It's been criminally hidden away, mostly taken up by music, computing, engineering, those kind of fields that's had some sort of sway in. But the book itself, which I'm sure you could put in the show notes, so James Carr's Finite and Infinite Games, I've put a wonky piece where I challenge the value of graduation ceremonies and awarding of degrees, but I put it into a wonky forum, which is people that make their living talking about higher education. So that's a very, I think, easily accessible few hundred words I wrote there. And that's about it. It's just this is not a very burgeoning area of research at the moment, but I'm hoping to make a contribution. I'm working on a paper. I'm going to be presenting on something next year. We're working on a special edition for the philosophy of education. A couple of colleagues in Edinburgh are hosting it. It's going to be a special issue on gameplay within higher education, and I'm hoping I'll have a piece, or I should have a piece within that. So once that's ready to go some point next year, hopefully I can share details of that as well.
Cool. So to sum up everything you've said with one sentence, what would it be?
You can play a different game.
Brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure, Sunny. Thank you so much.
Thank you.